Hi, welcome to Ezekiel, Part 2, Lesson 2, which will actually be listed on the video as Lesson 12, because we're just going to number them concurrently. Before we get started with today's lesson, which actually covers chapters 35 and 36, I want to go back a little bit to the end of chapter 34, verses 25 through 31. I don't think we really talked about this enough, about this covenant of peace that God says He's going to make with Israel. And a covenant, if you haven't studied covenant with us, is a solemn, unbreakable agreement, either between two people or between God and humanity. And so we've actually heard of this covenant of peace before. If you studied Daniel with us, we saw it in Daniel 9, verse 27. But in the covenant of peace in Ezekiel 34, and again in Daniel 9, verse 27, those are not the same covenants of peace. The one in Daniel is actually made by the Prince of Desolation, when he makes the covenant for 7 years, but it's broken after 3.5 years. In Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 25, God is the one making a covenant with the Jewish people, and that covenant is eternal. God doesn't break covenant. Our God is a covenant God. And if you remember, in the middle of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, before the third siege, we had all kinds of people, all these false prophets, going around yelling, "Peace, peace," and there was no peace. But now that they're actually out of the land, what does God actually promise them? He's promising them peace. As a matter of fact, He's putting it in a covenant. And that got me to thinking, when we get ourselves in some really nasty places, like, our nation is right now, we beg God for peace. But God can't grant us peace while we're still living in our sin. God has to move us from where we are to a place of absolute brokenness and total dependence on Him. And only then can He actually give us peace. And then we personally and as a nation collectively will know that He is Adonai Shalom. He is our God of peace. In verses 26 and 29, we get some I will statements. God actually is making promises. And those promises, those I will statements, say that I will make them and the places around my hill a blessing. He's going to cause showers to come down in their seasons, and they're going to be showers of blessing. They're not going to have to go through a drought anymore. He's going to establish for them a renowned planting place, so they will never go through a famine again. We see a contrast to that in Ezekiel 4, in Ezekiel 14, and really even in Ezekiel chapter 6 and 7. First, God says He's going to break the staff of bread. So bread and water are going to be very scarce. If you remember Ezekiel's pictorial prophecies, it was even that he was supposed to eat and drink with fear and with trembling. And then in chapter 6 and 7, that's when God actually prophesied against the mountains or against the actual land of Israel. And the purpose is found in verse 27. Then they will know that I am the Lord. And that's actually the theme of the entire book of Ezekiel. Then you, or then they, will know that I am the Lord. So with that little background, we're caught up now, and we're going to move on to chapter 34. And this chapter is all about a prophecy against Seir. And Mount Seir is actually Edom. And we can see that in Ezekiel chapter 25, in Genesis 25, in Genesis 32, in Genesis 36, and the entire book of Obadiah, which is only 24 verses long. And if you remember, mountains can refer to either mountains, like physical mountains, places of pagan worship. We see it listed as kind of high places, or nations. In these verses, chapter 35, verse 1, all the way through to chapter 36, 15, it's actually talking about the nations or about the land. If you look in verse 1 through 9, what actually happens to Mount Seir? Well, God says He's going to make it a desolation and a waste. He's going to give it over to bloodshed. He's going to fill it with people slain by the sword. So a battle is going to come to Mount Seir, to Edom. And I want to read verse 5 to you of chapter 35 in Ezekiel. It says, "Because you, Mount Seir, have had everlasting enmity and have delivered the sons of Israel to the power of the sword at the time of their calamity, at the time of the punishment of the end. Therefore, as I live, declares the Lord, I will give you over to bloodshed, and bloodshed will pursue you, since you have not hated bloodshed. Therefore, bloodshed will pursue you. That punishment to the end, that's the avan. That's the consequence of, or a punishment for iniquity. So while God was dealing with Israel, when God was passing his judgment and giving them the consequence or their punishment for their iniquity that they had committed against God, Mount Seir, Edom, took advantage of that. And because of their everlasting enmity or everlasting hatred toward Israel, Edom is now going to have to endure an everlasting desolation. So in my Bible, I just circled in verse 5, everlasting enmity, and in verse 9, everlasting desolation, and just kind of connected the two of them together. When we start looking in verses 10 through 15, it tells us exactly why Edom is going to be judged by God this harshly. And it says Edom decided they were going to possess the land of not only Judah, which was the only part of the nation that was still existing, but also the land of Israel. It hated Israel, it envied Israel, it reviled the mountains of Israel. And so they said they were given to Edom. And that reviled, that na'atsa, means to have contempt or to have blasphemy. They spoke arrogantly, or they magnified themselves against God by claiming the land that God had given to Jacob or to Israel as their own. As a matter of fact, if we flip real quick over to the book of Amos, chapter 1, verse 11, it actually gives us the sins of Edom. And this is what it says. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because he pursued his brother with the sword. While he stifled his compassion, his anger also tore continually, and he maintained his fury forever. We read later on in chapter 36 or 35 that when God makes Edom desolate, the whole rest of the world is actually going to be rejoicing. And then Edom is going to have a realization. God tells us that when this occurs, they will know that he is the Lord, that Yada. They'll know by experience. They'll be able to recognize him. They will admit, they will acknowledge God as Lord, and they will have a confession that God is Lord. And that Lord is the tetragrammaton, the Yod He Vav He, the unpronounceable name of God, which literally means the existing one. The one who was, who is, and who is to come. And unlike Israel, there's not going to be any remnant left in Edom. As a matter of fact, in verse 15, it says, so I will do to you. You will be a desolation, O Mount Seir, and all of Edom, all of it. In 126 AD, Emperor Herc actually compelled Edom to become Jewish people, and Israel absorbed them into the land of Edom. One famous Edomite in the Brit, or the New Testament, was actually Herod. His mother was an Edomite. Looking at the first 15 verses of chapter 36, we see it's actually a continuation of chapter 35. It's just the second part of the Word of God. And this part of the prophecy is not about the mountains of Edom anymore, but about the mountains of Israel. In verses 1 through 7, we still see that Edom is their enemy. But if you look in verse 3, God tells Israel that they were crushed for a good reason. That literally means for a good because. What's Israel been enduring this entire time but the insults of the nation, the kalima, the disgrace and the shame and the insult and the dishonor? It says there are talk among the people and a whispering of the people. That whispering is a deba. The people have been whispering defamation and giving an evil report about Israel. And not only Israel, but about their God. And why would Israel be a talk? Why would Israel be a whisper among the people? Because they're not in their land anymore. Their land is a complete desolation. Their temple was destroyed. And if you remember, in Near Eastern antiquity, gods were connected to the land. And so if they weren't in the land, if the land was a desolation, if the temple was gone, if the people were gone, then they also had no God. But we see the theme of Ezekiel, then you or they will know that I am God. What the nations were actually doing is they were speaking out against. If an army lost, especially to this magnitude where they lost everything and the people were taking, it wasn't so much that an enemy army was better than their army, but that their God was stronger than their enemy's God. Babylon's God was seen as stronger than Israel's God. But God said when all of these things happen, they will know who the true God is. And they will know that it's me. So how is God going to deal? Or how is God going to speak against Edom? When you look at verse 5 and 6, it tells us, and his jealousy and in his wrath. His wrath, his hamah, his hot displeasure, or with his burning anger. And so what was Edom's crime again? They gave my land for themselves as a possession. So what's going to happen to these nations? God said they're going to start enduring their own insults. God is going to judge them according to their ways and their deeds. So as they treated Israel, God was now going to treat them. Moving on, starting in verse 8 through verse 15. God's going to allow the land to prosper. And why does he say that the land is going to prosper? Because people will come soon. But how soon is soon? 70 years after their captivity for a near-time fulfillment. But really, this is an end-time prophecy that hasn't been done yet. So soon is a really long time. Our forever may be, 2 hours. We say, oh, it's reigned forever and ever, and it's been just a couple of hours. God's forever is an eternal forever. He doesn't mark time the way we do. So in comparison to God's eternity and God's forever, 70 years, 1,000 years would be considered soon. Then God makes some promises. He starts again with a list of I will statements. But what had God told them before? He says, what I say, I will do. God's words are not worthless. And this is his promise to Israel. He's going to turn to them. They will be cultivated, they will be tilled and be sown. The land is going to be fertile. He's going to multiply people, so it's going to be inhabited. He says Israel is going to be inhabited, it's going to be rebuilt. He's going to treat them formerly, but better than he did at first. People are going to possess their inheritance of the land. And he's not going to let them hear the nation's insults. And never, ever again will Israel be a reproach. And so when God does this, the land, God promises, will never be bereaved of children again. And that bereaved is to be deprived of a loved one through a profound absence, and especially due to death. But who are the children? The people of Israel. And who will never be bereaved of their people again? The land. Because it's going to be inhabited by the people for eternity. In verses 16 to 21, we move away from the prophecy about the land, and this is now a prophecy about the actual house or the people of Israel. And it starts out by reminding them what they had done. They defiled their land with their idols and their sin. And so because of that, what did God do? He poured out his wrath on them. He scattered them among the nations, and he's going to judge them according to their ways. A huge repeated phrase in the book of Ezekiel. And when Israel is in other lands and scattered, what was profaned? God's holy name. We see it in verse 20, 21, 22, and twice in verse 23. And that profane means to cause something that used to be revered to be identified as nothing but common. So in my Bible, I circled my holy name, my great name, and then I connected all of them. God's name was being profaned because his reputation was being defamed. Who God is was being defamed. Why aren't the people living in the land that God gave them? And could that be seen as some kind of failing on God's part? Could Israel have looked at it, even the priests, if you remember when we looked at when God took Ezekiel by the hair into Jerusalem in a vision, and the priests were worshiping pagan pictures and unclean animals, and what did they say? They said, God's gone and God doesn't see us anymore. What then would the nations around them believe about their God? That he was weak? That he was nothing? That he couldn't even protect his family? You know, Israel had a reputation of being protected, of being victorious in battle. They went into a turnkey country. They had houses they didn't have to build. They had farms they didn't have to plant. They had animals they didn't have to mate, to grow. Everything was given to them, and now everything was taken from them. So what did that then tell the nations about their God? He was nothing. He was just as common as they were. God is concerned with his holy name, his reputation among the nations. What are we doing in the midst of these various crises that we call 2020 to God's holy name? Are we holding it up, or are we profaning it to the nations? In verse 22, it tells us what God's going to do and why he's going to do it. He's going to vindicate the holiness of his name. And he's going to prove himself holy among the people of Israel, and the nations are going to see it. He gives a bunch of I will statements to how he's going to vindicate his holy name. First, he's going to gather Israel from all the lands, and he's going to bring them back to their own land, the land of their possession, of their inheritance. He's going to clean them from all their filthiness, their uncleanliness, their idols. He's going to give them a new heart and a new spirit. He's going to put his spirit within them, and that spirit's going to cause them to obey. He's going to be their God, and they're going to be his people. He's going to multiply. There's going to be abundant grain, abundant fruit, abundant produce. There's going to be increase of the field, and he will never again bring them to famine. And when this happens, what will the people do? According to Ezekiel 26, verse 31 and 32, it says, "Then you, Israel, will remember your evil ways and your deeds that were not good, and you will loathe yourselves in your own sight for your iniquities and your abominations. I'm not doing this for your sake, declares the Lord God. Let it be known to you. Be ashamed and confounded," which means to blush, "for your ways, O house of Israel." They're going to remember their evil ways and their deeds. They're going to loathe themselves for their abominations. God actually calls them to be ashamed and confounded, to blush, to be embarrassed for what they've done. Are we embarrassed and ashamed when we look at what we are doing and the way we are handling things right now? Verses 33 to the end of the chapter tells us what else God is going to cause to happen. He's going to allow the cities to be inhabited and fortified. All the waste places are going to be rebuilt. The desolate land is going to be cultivated. It's going to be tilled like the Garden of Eden. There's going to increase the people in Israel like a flock. This is an end time prophecy. This is what's going to happen. when Jesus comes again, when God comes for his eternal reign. And in verse 36, the nations are going to know that it was the Lord who rebuilt the ruined places. And then Israel will know that he is Lord. Thank you for joining us for Ezekiel Lesson 12. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. While you're on our channel, go over and check out our new series upon further review, and make sure you drop us a note in the comment section. Until next time, shalom, shalom.